Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is episode 9 in the ongoing series Christopher Watts, What Else Do We Know? You may have noticed the coverage on this channel of the Chris Watts case has kind of become less. That's kind of intentional. I did want to give a little bit of attention to the John Benet Ramsey case. I wrote a book about that case, which came out just after Christmas. And then I just wanted to do also some coverage of the Madeleine McCann case. And probably around this time next week, the coverage of the Chris Watts case will sort of begin to tick up again. I still want to get back to the analysis of that episode of Criminal Confessions, just going into other things that Tammy Lee was saying. But for now, we're going to basically just stick to Christopher Watts, What Else Do We Know? So, episode 10 in the series will probably come out around about the weekend. And then there'll be quite a lot more of analysis of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann just in the next week. If you want to catch the ongoing series of Christopher Watts, there'll probably be 20, 30 additional episodes in this series. Then please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So we are in September. We're dealing with September 2018 in the chronology. We will be dealing with points number 11 to I think around about 23 in the timeline that was posted on Crime Rocket chronologically. So as the information came out, it was posted, and what we're doing is sort of going through that timeline also chronologically, knowing what we know, but also kind of looking at what we didn't know or maybe didn't realize, or how sort of false information or inaccurate information was part of that chronology, and just seeing where that leaves us. Now, I think you'll find in this respect, there's another channel out there that's talking about an ongoing investigation. We will sort of, I'll certainly leave a comment on whether that's logical or laughable. So, but I will explain that sort of towards the end of this episode. So we start at point number 11, and the question is it possible for a small screen, like a baby monitor, to capture the scenario of an adult strangling an infant? Now, this was still at the point where, we hadn't heard the confession. We didn't quite know what was going on, but it looked like there was going to be a trial. And so what was happening was people were basically already, believing that Christopher Watts killed his whole family, and we're trying to find ways to sort of preemptively argue against his defense, or find arguments for the prosecution. As it turned out, that wasn't necessary, but it's nevertheless interesting how that process happened. Now, early in September, you had channels like HLN with Ashley Banfield kind of taking on this sort of whole idea of, you've got this baby monitor. Chris Watts said in his in the arrest affidavit, which was based on the first confession, that he saw on the baby monitor what Shannan was doing, and he said he also saw that Bella, who'd been strangled first, was blue in the face. And what's kind of interesting with his first confession was, in his first confession, Bella was strangled first and then Cece. In his third confession, it was the other way around. In his third confession, Cece was strangled first and then Bella. And I think the second, so I think the second and third just changed that order around. Just a simple thing like that just shows you Chris Watts hadn't really thought out his version very clearly. So, but the issue that Ashley Banfield wanted to sort of test here and experiment with was this whole idea of, could you tell on the monitor that the child was blue in her face? Could you see that? And she did kind of a little experiment, which was very good. It's good to be practical on these issues. And in the experiment, she kind of turned the lights off. Bear in mind that this crime, according to Chris Watts, happened before sunrise. It happened, around 5 o'clock in the morning or something. And so the lights would likely have been off. Especially if it was a kind of a spontaneous situation. I didn't want to wake the children. And so in a situation like that, you are not going to see the color you're not really going to see any color on a baby monitor. And so, we know Chris Watts is a liar, but it was important just to show that this argument didn't really hold any water. Ironically, I think it's true what he's saying. I do think that the children were blue in their faces. And I think that is a vital insight into this. People will say, well, so what? So what if they were blue in their faces? It makes a big difference. If they were blue in their faces, it means they'd not just died. And also, the manner of death is going to cause that kind of pallor. If you're strangled, you're not going to appear that way, certainly not immediately, and not necessarily at all. John Benet Ramsey was strangled. She was garroted. And when you look at her, we've got photos of her, and when you look at her, she doesn't really look pale. She doesn't really look very, very white. And in fact, the one side of her face is actually quite a red color. So one's got to sort of look at that aspect. The other thing is, if you look at John Benet Ramsey, she's got a lot of petechial hemorrhages. There's struggling as you're being strangled. There's fingernails trying to, remove the garrote, but she's certainly struggling. There's also dark sort of impressions on her chest where it looked like something was happening, some kind of struggle. She also had scratch marks on her shoulders, and so these are the kind of typical defensive wounds you would expect in a situation like that. You don't really have any of that with the Watts children. You could argue that the oil removed some of this evidence because it's the sort of exterior of the skin. I don't really think that's true. I don't think they were in the oil really long enough. But it's certainly, a defense attorney could certainly argue that could muddy the autopsy. It could certainly make it kind of problematic. But that's why I say Chris Watts saying that the children were blue, I think is true. And that points to the fact that the children were killed early on, not through strangling, but through a drug overdose. And this is typical. People who die from a drug overdose do typically, it's one of the obvious symptoms is that they turn blue. Their system shut down, and then you have this kind of blue thing. And And so that's why I think Chris Watts is correct and accurate and not lying when he says they look blue. Even the way that he talks about it is quite. It kind of resonates. Just the way that he says it's like nothing I saw in my life. You know, that's something. Seeing a dead body, even if you're a murderer, is going to be somewhat traumatic. As crazy as that sounds. As traumatic as murder is, even the murderer is going to be somewhat traumatized by having to handle dead bodies constantly. And a lot of people don't realize that, when they're so busy demonizing and monstrosizing a murderer, you don't realize what it's like for them. And I'm not sympathizing with him. I'm simply saying that him talking about his children being blue and this being something that stuck with him and kind of haunted him is, I think, authentic. And so all of this sort of came out of the whole idea of looking at the baby monitor footage. Just a couple of other things just to mention, and again, this is all from point number 11. When you look at the sort of text scrolling along the bottom, the sort of ticker tape scrolling along the bottom of the tweet that, it was a tweet of coverage on HLN, but what you see is an announcement from Anadarko saying that, they're going to cooperate with the investigation and, anyone with any inquiries must refer them to law enforcement, which is kind of a way of Anadarko kind of saying, we're going to help law enforcement, but we're not going to be transparent. We're not going to talk to the media. And in fact, they really didn't. You sort of got nothing from Anadarko from this point onwards. Anadarko worked with law enforcement. They gave them information. But you've got to admit, even Kissinger, who was sort of their employee, and you can argue that technically she wasn't an employee, but she worked in their offices, she worked for them, maybe via some other agency, but ultimately she was Chris Watts's co-worker. And, she wasn't completely transparent herself, and you sort of ask yourself, if Anadarko were completely cooperative, then how come Nicole Kissinger wasn't? And by that I simply mean Nicole Kissinger didn't simply hand over her phone and everything was just sort of provided like on a silver platter. There was kind of, some things were not provided immediately and some things weren't provided at all. So this idea that Anadarko just sort of turned on its, turned sort of belly up and kind of said, just take whatever you want, we'll give you everything. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's strictly true. And, we know that Kissinger also lost her job, I think around about the 22nd or something, but basically shortly after what had happened to Chris Watts. And one can argue that her dismissal wasn't really fair. I mean, what did she do wrong? She had an affair with a co-worker, right? I mean, is that a dismissible offense? You could argue that it is, but then you should apply the same standard to other Anadarko employees, and I doubt whether one could. You could apply it to very high up corporates in Anadarko and say, well, if you've cheated on your wife, you should be dismissed. Across all the thousands of employees. And, if every company did that, they would be constantly halving their workforces, right? In any event, it was in this time, early September, that the case was really like kind of a brush fire through the media. It was really national news. To some extent, it was international news. And it was in People magazine in America, and it was just basically everywhere. And Ashley Banfield was one of those people covering it every single day. And Crime Rocket kind of, I was writing a book at the time, again, very, very early on, and the whole idea was to say we actually have an incredible amount of information to go on. It's clear that Chris Watts committed this crime, and it's clear that this happened and that happened and so on. And a lot of the reason why it was possible, I felt, to write a book was because you had this constant wall-to-wall coverage with so much information. And a lot of this information, as I say, was coming out from HLN, from Ashley Banfield. And it was quite a shock when she was shut down, or she was taken off the air, or she simply stopped covering the Watts case. It was a shock because of the amount and quality and quantity of coverage from her. And a lot of people complained, why is it Chris Watts again? But one must also ask, why did that happen? Like, why did Ashley Banfield stop covering the Chris Watts case? Also, why did it kind of, it wasn't just that Ashley Banfield stopped covering it, it kind of completely went off the air from being on every single day to gone. 1 minute there, 1 minute completely gone. And I found that quite sinister and quite strange. Even now, I find that quite strange. And, where's Ashley Banfield now? What is she doing now? Why did that happen? Was it a circumstance completely unrelated to the Chris Watts case? Was it something to do with her own contracts? So that was something that I was certainly curious about. And so, you've got, as I say, you've got this other channel talking about, the investigation into Chris Watts is ongoing. I don't believe that's true. I certainly don't think that it's an open investigation. It's quite simple. It's an investigation is either open or closed. The John Benet Ramsey investigation is open. There's no in the case of a homicide, the statute of limitations doesn't apply. A homicide case is always open in terms of unsolved, as is the case in the John Benet Ramsey case. But that's not the case in the Chris Watts case because it has been solved. The person's in jail serving his sentence, so that is not the case. No charges have been filed against anyone else. There is no ongoing investigation. But what one can say is that it does look like there was an ongoing effort to make sure that was the case, that was the result. In other words, one can see why and how it could be damaging to Anadarko if the case did continue in any way. And I guess this is where I have got to admit a little bit of interest, sensitivity, awareness, just kind of pondering whether there's the likelihood of a deliberate conspiracy. If there is, it's kind of like, wow. If there isn't, it's so what kind of thing. It's not going to change a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if it's true, and if it's not true, it would be interesting. But it's kind of, on September the 5th, and this is point number 12, another woman came forward to say that she'd had an affair with Watts and that they'd met on Tinder. And on the one hand, you could say that this was true, and that's the reason Chris Watts would want the plea deal, because he didn't want information like this to come out. He'd been cheating on his wife all along, and He had a lot to hide. He had a lot of skeletons in the closet, and he took the plea deal because he wanted to make sure that none of this information ever came to light, as he knew it would in a trial. What's interesting is how you link this to the plea deal. You kind of say, okay, now the plea deal makes sense. If you take it away, the plea deal doesn't really make much sense. If you take away the fact that he sort of had this other sex life with other people, and maybe that he was bisexual, you take that away, then you say, why the heck would he take a plea deal when the death penalty wasn't even on the cards, and he kind of had a shot at a defense, right? And so it's very convenient to whoever wanted the plea deal besides Chris Watts. In other words, I don't think Chris Watts wanted the plea deal. I think it was foisted onto him. I think he was convinced that it was his only option. I don't think it was his only option, but in any event, I think it suited other people that there was a plea deal as well. I think it suited other interests in a very big way. And so one's got to ask, was it just coincidence that this woman came forward saying she had an affair? Because the result of this was that you started paying attention to her. And what does that mean? It meant you weren't paying attention to Nicole Kessinger. If Chris Watts was in jail not talking to anyone, then Nicole Kessinger was going to be the best sort of avenue for the tabloids to follow, right? And the only way you're going to change that is if you kind of held out carrots for the media to chew on and chomp on. And, that was now going to become the story. And that's kind of exactly what happened. On September the 5th, as I say, this woman came forward and she said, that he had rape fantasies and he didn't like to be dominated as he was in his marriage. And all of this had kind of a grain of truth about it. The part that didn't really have a grain of truth was that I don't think Chris Watts was the kind of guy who was kind of a serial philanderer or someone who was going to cheat a lot. I don't think he did a very good job, if you want to put it in such a crass sort of way, in terms of his affair with Kessinger. I think it was easy to conduct the affair while Shannan was away for 6 weeks or 5 weeks. But I think he knew it wasn't going to be easy to keep up while Shannan was in town. I think he knew he kind of had no game, and so when she was back, it was all going to be over, and he didn't want it to be over. So that's quite important to bear in mind, is that he wasn't very good at hiding the affair. He wasn't going to be very good at, hiding it or playing this game when they were both in town, and he knew it. So this idea that he was having affairs with other people just on an ongoing basis just doesn't have any merit. You wouldn't know that if you didn't know Chris Watts. You would just think, oh, well, he had an affair with one person, why wouldn't he have an affair with someone else? And so the point that I made at the time, point number 12, is I said, I'm not sure whether to put much faith in this allegation of this other woman coming forward. It was obviously Amanda McMahon. But if true, the allegations of rape fantasies show he did not like to be dominated. It also suggests he fantasized about strangling his wife long before he did, which feeds into premeditation and sadism. I believe that's true. I believe he did fantasize about killing his family before it happened. When I say fantasized, I don't really mean it in the sort of titillating sense that he enjoyed the idea. I think he simply was tempted by the idea of how he was going to get rid of his family so that he could entertain his real fantasy, which was being with Kessinger. So it's fantasy in that sense. I don't think Chris Watts wanted to to murder his family. I don't think he was looking forward to it. I don't think he was like excited by the idea that he was going to enjoy it. Instead, I think he simply was tempted. It was a way to solve his problems, not an alternative that he liked, but one that he preferred to the more difficult alternative, which was getting a divorce and allowing Shannan to control the outcome, kind of what was going to be said about him. I've recently been in that situation myself, where you involved in something with someone, and then it doesn't go very well, and then they want to portray everything that happened in a certain way that's not true. And that's sometimes terrifying. It's terrifying that someone is going to portray you in a way that's negative, or in a way that's I won't take it further than that, but it can make you feel, it can make you panic, can make you worry, especially if you've got other things that you want to continue with, or whatever it is. So yeah, this takes us to point number 13, September 5th, according to People. So this is happening at the same time. So at the same time that this other woman has come forward, September 5th, on the same day, People magazine talks about a co-worker with whom Colorado triple murder suspect Chris Watts was allegedly actively involved in an affair, has been opening up to the police. Can you see that? Can you see how at the same time that People magazine is kind of referring to Nicole Kessinger, on the exact same day, some other woman sort of comes out and says, hey, like waving a flag, like, almost like cheerleading the fact that I was involved with Chris Watts as well. Come and talk to me. I'm giving you a lot of salacious stuff. He tried to strangle me. He was into this rape thing and all this sort of detail, right? And that's exactly what the tabloids do. They run to her. That becomes the conversation. What would have been the conversation if she wasn't there? Well, Nicole Kessinger. And so in People magazine, that they talk about authorities confirmed the cheating, they confirmed the affair, they confirmed it's with a co-worker, everything except they don't say her name. And obviously what's perfect is this other person coming forward, in inverted commas. She's going to give her name, and now it's going to be all about her. Do the media want to talk about this person whose identity can't be revealed, and there's no photo of her, versus someone else whose identity can be revealed and there's a photo of her and all this kind of salacious detail. So obviously that is where the media were led. And so I just found all of this very intriguing and very interesting. And as time has gone by, I've sort of found it even more so. You have the same thing with Trent Bolt. It's the same, as far as I'm concerned, tactic. You've also got to say, was this a ploy that involved two people, or was it a ploy that involved one person and then another person sort of jumped on the bandwagon as well? Or were they both part of the same ploy? Because Trent Bolt seems to have some connection to the oil industry, or he just seems to kind of be aware of it. So that's certainly just something to kind of bear in mind, I guess. And then that brings us to point number 14. Shannan's social media output dropped drastically in the month that she was murdered. Did she suspect a serious deterioration in the family dynamic, or was she starting to experience it? And I think this proved to be true. We know that in August, Shannan, obviously at this time we didn't know this. At this time we didn't have access to the phone data review. We didn't have access to Shannan's texts. We didn't really know much about Chris Watts's week in North Carolina. That wasn't really clear. And so just looking at those numbers, the fact that there were no videos in August did seem to show that something was going on, and something was going on. I mean, when I wrote here in point number 14 in September 2018, bear in mind the discovery came out, more than 2.5 months later. The question is, did she suspect a serious deterioration, and was she starting to experience it? Yes. She said that week was the worst week of her life, that she was crying every night and crying herself to sleep, and experienced Chris Watts's cold, and she didn't know who he was. And this affected her emotionally to such an extent that she didn't put up any videos. Part of it may have been Chris Watts deleting his Facebook and just saying, I've had enough with all of this thriving, on Facebook. I don't want to be part of it anymore. And she may have said, well, look, I'll stop. Let's talk about it. Let's sort it out. We're going to need to do this to keep our finances going. And maybe that was what she was going to talk to him about if and when they went to Aspen on their sort of romantic weekend together, building up their marriage. But then it never happened. Of course, Chris wasn't not wanting to appear in the videos just because of whatever he was saying. It's because he didn't want Nicole Kessinger to eventually see it, or her friends. And that's another aspect is, didn't Chris Watts do what he did, and wasn't he afraid of what he did? Again, in terms of how do you have an affair with someone when the other person, the rival, your partner, your official partner, is in town with you? The other aspect is, what about the friends of that person? What about Nicole Kessinger's friends? And we know that on August 12th, arguably the day of the murders of the children, but certainly the day of running up, Shannan Watts was supposed to be murdered that night if she'd arrived on time. So let's just call it the day of the murders. But the point being, on August 12th, that Sunday, the Sunday of the birthday party, Nicole Kessinger did tell her friend Charlotte Nelson about Chris Watts. I don't think she mentioned his name, but she did say that she was seeing someone and it's early and so on. And if she was telling her, she may have also told other friends, and she may have said to Chris Watts, I told my friend about you and ... And this may have alarmed him even more. This may have made him even more sort of certain that he had to, in one sense, it was good that her friends knew. It meant that she was serious about it. But on the other hand, the friends would start possibly looking at Shannan's Facebook and putting two and two together. And Watts may have felt he needs to take charge of Shannan's Facebook. He needs to start deleting things and getting rid of Shannan. So that may have been part of that as well. One must also look at July the 5th. The output there was the second lowest since February. It was slightly higher than March, but it was ultimately, July was a very low month as well. And we know that in July, what happened? Nutgate happened. So regardless of what you would say about that, I think Shannan was quite emotionally compromised, and her attention was sort of distracted at a critical time. One can even say that maybe Nutgate happened because it was almost a unconscious reaction to what she intuitively or subconsciously knew, but didn't quite know, if that makes sense. In other words, she wasn't feeling the love from her husband. she misinterpreted it as him just being introverted and inside of himself. Meanwhile, she wasn't actually getting that support from him. She wasn't actually getting that emotional reinforcement from him. And this kind of manifested in kind of a drama. And this drama was supposed to test, are you reliable? Can I rely on you? Are you going to come to my rescue? Are you going to be on my side? And the answer was kind of no. He tried to sort of pretend that he was going to sort it out, but we know how he ultimately did sort it out. So that's certainly an interesting aspect as well. Then number 15, Shannan Watts appears to be related to the actor Peter Onorati. I'm just going to be completely honest here and just say, although I elected to spell Shannan's name that way, SHAN''ANN, as a writer, someone who's written books and books, so many books about this case, it's very irritating to have to do that every single time. I mean, that was a standard I set. I felt that was how she was, acknowledged, at the funeral, and so I stuck to that. And it's kind of a lot of work, typing it out once is no big deal, but when you write a book and every single time you've got to type it out like that, and then also for consistency's sake, you want to check that you haven't spelled it the other way. It's an incredible headache. So it's really annoying every single time to type it out that way. And so there are a lot of people who say that I am against Shannan or whatever. Well, this effort to always spell her name right is certainly contrary to that. It's making an effort to refer to Shannan as she seemed to refer to herself, certainly phonetically. And what is also interesting is all these different names. Her mother wasn't Sandy Rusek. Her mother's Sandy Onorati. I'm talking about how she was referred to in the media. Then you sort of ask yourself why. Why are they referred to like that when it's, And so early on, again in September, I thought that she could be related to the actor Peter Onorati. I'm not sure if that's absolutely true, but that appeared to be true, certainly. Then I guess at the same time I was looking at just the family dynamics, and so another one that came up, again, you must look at this chronologically. This is just the information I was collating at the time, very early on. Ari King is the brother of Shannan's first husband. So at that time, I didn't actually know it was Leonard King. But in the news, Ari King had told 9 News that how he felt. And he said, I'm sick over it, honestly. He said, any family she has here in North Carolina, we're heartbroken. And so I wasn't sure what Shannan's first husband's name was, but I did provide kind of a screen grab showing possible relatives, and at the bottom of that list was Leonard King. I was, I think, a little bit hesitant to say this for a fact just because you could be wrong. But yeah, it was because there was also a Michael King on that list, so I wasn't quite sure. But what is interesting on that same list is it shows one of the Ruseks resident in Broomfield, Colorado. And that's obviously when they stayed in sorry, that's actually those lists of locations aren't I don't think they relate to the relatives, that they relate to the recent locations of Shannan Watts, which is Erie, Aberdeen, Charlotte, Broomfield, Belmont, quite a few different places. Even looking back at this, it's just easy to kind of make assumptions and make mistakes. As I say, we do know for a fact that the Ruseks did stay with the Watts family for 15 months in Colorado. So one could actually expect in kind of a search on that kind of information that might come up. That the Ruseks had lived in Colorado at some point. Okay, then number 17, the following neighbors have been identified thus far: Colleen Hendrickson, Ann Watt, and Betty Marcoux. According to Marcoux, Watts' truck was on when she left for the gym early Monday. She goes to the gym at 5:15 a.m. 5 days each week, and she said she hadn't noticed him heading out somewhere at that time before. The night before he was barbecuing, she said. So Betty Marcoux kind of emerged early on as an excellent witness, just not only in terms of the last time Chris Watts was seen by somebody else, but also the first time he was seen the next morning. I also think what's kind of ridiculous is all the commentary about the red vehicle and this mysteriousness around it when it's the neighbor getting up to go to gym. We know that for a fact. It's reported in the media, but these conspiracy folks want to turn it into, why on earth would an accomplice park their car in a neighbor's property? And then the neighbor goes to gym, wouldn't she notice it herself? If the neighbor notices Watts' car, why wouldn't she notice someone else's car? It's that kind of logic failure that is really pathetic. Anyway, number 18, public records show that they were each arrested multiple times in North Carolina. He 3 times and her 15 times, but the charges in the arrest are not known. So this is an article in the Daily Mail. This is a British tabloid from August the 17th, and it was incorrect. But this is how rumors start and how conspiracies and gossip sort of get their traction. The Daily Mail is a tabloid. It's not terrible. Sometimes I guess it is, but this was a error in terms of turning collie birds into calling birds. It's just like a slight misattribution, but it ends up becoming a misrepresentation. And how I responded to this information is saying, well, on the one hand, it could explain why the couple left North Carolina in such a hurry. I'm trying to figure out why this happened, and sold their house with all the furniture still inside. But on the other hand, I said, and this is just showing that true crime rocket science is trying to maintain an open mind and a neutral footing. I said, on the other hand, it's possible that the Daily Mail confused Shannan Watts with the apostrophe with Shannan Ann Watts, a 28-year-old woman arrested 3 times and facing 16 charges in North Carolina. And so, I had to go and find this information of this other person in order to verify that it was likely not true and likely not Shannan Watts. Incidentally, that piece of information, which turned out to be misinformation, was provided to Crime Rocket by a reader. So it wasn't something that I found and reported on. It was something that was shown to me, and I then basically wasn't sure whether it was valid or not. And I said so at the time. Number 19, more reason to believe Chris Watts could be bisexual comes via a profile posted on Adam for Adam, and the profile picture showing a man with a goatee. So this information is also coming out at this time, like September 5th, when everyone should be thinking about Nicole Kessinger. Instead, they are thinking about other things, which are arguably misinformation, including this article in the Daily Mail. And so you've kind of got this profile on this sort of male website, and it's pretty convincing. It talks about someone looking for trouble, who's an engineer in the mining, oil and gas drilling industry, provides a Denver zip code. It talks about a 31-year-old, which suggested Chris Watts had been at this for 2 years or something. It gave the same height as Chris Watts, as 5'11" and 170 pounds. And yeah, it all seemed very much a match. But one thing that wasn't a match was Chris's birthday makes him a Taurus. And in one post, Shannan praised Chris from going from a size 38 to a 32. And this is a point raised by a guy called Lynn Cole on Twitter. So if this profile had been created 2 years earlier, which would have been accurate in terms of the date, of his age, unless he was lying about his age, it doesn't look like it. It looks like someone tried to make a profile representing Chris Watts, and they just didn't get the details completely right. Chris Watts' birthday is in May 17, so that makes him a Taurus, not a Gemini, as the bi guy profile shows. Even the photo of the bi guy looks a bit like Chris Watts. It showed the last login activity for this profile as April the 5th, 2018. And that's where one can say, well, is this a coincidence or is this manufactured? In other words, did some nefarious entity set up this profile and to contaminate the narrative? Did they mess with the metadata so that it would appear to be April 5th, even though it had perhaps come up much later? Or is this merely a coincidence that there just happened to be an oil worker in Denver that looked quite a lot like Chris Watts, sounded like him, same height, same everything, but he was bisexual? It's possible, and I'm not sure one way or the other what you think about that. I think the best way to get certainty is to go to this particular website and get the metadata from them and say, well, what does it say here? Who is this guy? What does the browser history show? The ISP, whatever. And, when last was this person on this profile? When was this profile set up? And all that kind of thing. And it might turn out to be completely innocent in the sense that maybe it was some other person from Denver. But it doesn't look like it was Chris Watts, just because I don't think Chris Watts is bisexual. So that's the bottom line. Then point number 20, the walk to the top of an oil tank and actual photos of the Anadarko oil tank site. So I put this up quite early in September, and these screen grabs came from a video that was made from Anadarko infrastructure, and it literally just showed an oil worker walking up the kind of metal catwalk and opening the thief hatch. And there was very, very little content like that, especially not from Anadarko. It was just very, very hard to kind of visualize what Chris Watts was supposed to have done. And so this video provided incredible footage of this. And it even shows the thief hatch being opened. You see the toolbox there. You can see inside the thief hatch. And it was the first time one could sort of look at that and sort of begin to imagine, would it be possible to fit children's bodies through there? And even though one could see that footage, it was still quite a difficult thing to call. And subsequently, that video has been removed. And that's why I say the sensitivity around Anadarko and Anadarko's interest just seems really, really interesting. We know that they were in a billion-dollar merger, a very, very big merger, and kind of unprecedented amongst the majors in recent history. So billions of dollars were on the line, and you would get massive, massive negative publicity if you had a high-profile trial dealing with two Anadarko oil workers, and the public being completely focused and obsessed on this trial, but then indirectly on them, on Anadarko, on fracking, on their oil infrastructure, on safety. And that could literally wipe tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even billions off the value of their deal. So a lot of money rode on this, and so it would make sense just to make it go away, and that's exactly what happened. And so when you see a video like this disappearing as well, you've got to wonder, what is the reach? What is the actual reach of this vampire squid's tentacles? And what is its reach today? What is still going on? And do corporate entities basically control the law? Do they decide what is going to be the law? Do they decide what's going to be prosecuted? Do they decide, and I can tell you now that money determines the outcome of criminal cases. Money and PR basically can determine the criminal outcome of criminal cases, even if they're high profile, especially when they're high profile. So that brings us to point number 21. Police have found hundreds of hairs in the trunk of Chris Watts's truck. Sounds like hair fragments, which suggest the hair was cut or shaved. If true, it's a clear sign of processing a body, which involves the idea of planning and premeditation. This is kind of a mysterious aspect to this whole case, is this report of hundreds of hairs in the trunk, that's in the rear section of Chris Watts's truck. And one must wonder, what was going on with that, because the hair doesn't seem to be mentioned in the autopsy report. And one thing that's going to impact the ability of the bodies to decompose is something like hair. Hair can take longer to decompose and can also clog grates, when you are sequestrating oil and water in pipes. Hair is like a hair mat is going to potentially clog something like that up and cause alerts in the signaling system, in the monitoring system. And so one can imagine hair needing to be removed. And that would be a sign of what I call processing the body to prepare it for this disposal. And I don't think we have certainty on that aspect. We don't have it from the autopsy, and it's possible that, like the report in the Daily Mail, that this was a misattribution, but it's strange. It's not something that you would. It's not something like Shannan, Watts, and Shannan and Watts that you're going to miss here necessarily. It's possible, but I think it's a bit unlikely. And so it was on September 12th that I reported on this coming into the narrative, that these hundreds of pieces of hair found in the trunk of his truck. And then on September 10th, so 2 days before that, I published Two-Face, what I called the first definitive account of the case. So less than a month after the incident, my first book in the series came out, and the tagline for this book was "No one has been able to say why until now." And bizarrely, I think this still applies. I still think the True Crime Rocket Science version, not only the version of what happened, but also the version of why, I don't really think anyone else has been able to say it. You've had Chris Watts's version via Cheryl and Cadle, which sort of refers to demon possession. That's not true. You've got the crazy version of kids running around the driveway, which makes no sense in a premeditated crime, and also makes no sense in terms of these hair fragments in the back of the truck. Why would there be hair fragments if they were still alive running around? And I think I'm the only one who sort of pieced together the entire body of evidence and the body of sort of interrogations and all the statements from everybody, and put it all together in a cogent psychology where the psychology of each person fits into the broader mosaic. What a lot of other people have done is they take little fragments, knit them together, and then they put it on YouTube, and then that's their scenario, and everyone goes wow, and then they make another little fragment and they knit it together and they put that up. But none of them really hold together, and none of them really address the psychology of the actual characters involved. And if you had to ask these people, what kind of person do you think Chris Watts is? Like, what is his criminal psychology? They will tell you something very weak and misinformed, like he's a narcissist or he's a sociopath or something, which is another way of just saying, I don't know, I haven't thought about it, or that's what that expert says. They haven't figured out how this guy thinks or operates themselves, which is why their own theories are so fragmented. It's just this little piece, that little piece. And so I still think, obviously, I'm going to sing the praise of my own work, but I certainly wouldn't be singing the praises of it if it had been proved or discredited. If someone came along and said, see, this is absolute proof that either he's a narcissist, or this is absolute proof that he had a what do you call it? He had a accessory, or this is absolute proof that there's that video of the children running around the driveway. There you can see the child kicking off her shoe or tripping over Dieter, and there you can actually see her foot or arm lying on the driveway or whatever. You get none of that stuff. And so the joke with true crime is, when you make a mosaic, you have a giant mosaic. It's almost like if you imagine a mural, it's like the size of one wall of a large room. And that entire mural is kind of lots of little mosaics or kind of stamps or little stones that create a picture, and the stones conform to patterns, all sorts of patterns in terms of evidence and in terms of what is said and just behavioral patterns and so on, and so all of it just creates a picture, and a picture reinforces what's inside of it, and what's inside of it reinforces the picture, right? Does that make sense? And what a lot of these creators do is they don't have a picture. What they have is one little postage size stamp, and they keep harping on that little stamp that they've got. So they will go on and on and on and on about the shadows in the driveway, which is a tiny little fragment that you can barely make out. And then they try and turn that fragment into the entire mosaic, and it just doesn't work. People think it works because they just say it over and over and over again, but it doesn't. And so that's the difference between true crime rocket science and this conspiracy garbage. And so this brings us to the final point, and bizarrely, it is numbered 137. I think it was numbered 137 because the original way that I wrote this was, it was just going to be numbered like 1 to 500 or 1,000 or whatever it was. And so it was just going to be numbered. And then I found it was becoming more and more confusing, and I needed to separate the chronology into dates. Otherwise, it was just going to be very difficult to figure out what fitted where and when. And so this particular number was actually 137 in the timeline, in the chronology that I laid it down. But it was actually number 23 for September. And this is quite an interesting point that was raised, especially given what I've just mentioned earlier about corporate interests and so on. And it was a quote from a newspaper article in the Times Call, a local newspaper, and it referred to defense attorneys for Frederick Mann, accused of killing his wife and daughters, have filed a motion, this is obviously in September, asking the government to investigate whether the prosecution has made extrajudicial statements or tried to prevent the spread of prejudicial information. What this means is the authorities are accused of leaking evidence to the media and thus potentially prejudicing a jury trial. Stan Garnett, the former district attorney for Boulder County and also in charge of the John Benet Ramsey investigation or lack of, said it is not unusual for the defense to raise such issues early on, especially in high-profile cases. But he said, while it's standard to point out potential to prejudice a jury, he said the wording of the motion requiring the government to investigate the issue was unusual. He said it raises an issue as the district attorney's office is part of the executive branch of the state. If you're asking them to be investigated, who would do it? Garnett said. And so if you look at the merits of what is being kind of alleged here or talked about here, you've sort of got to wonder, what is the spread of prejudicial information? What is this thing about the prosecution making extrajudicial statements? It could be that the leaked information, if that is what happened, because what this is referring to specifically is that they're accused of leaking evidence to the media and potentially prejudicing a jury trial, right? Now look at when this is happening. It's all happening around September 12th. And that is exactly when the whole Amanda McMahon stuff came out, and also Trent Bolt. So one kind of has the impression, I'm not saying that this happened, I'm just saying it appears that the information regarding Trent Bolt and Amanda McMahon may have been leaked to the media by the prosecution to turn public sentiment against Chris Watts, to redirect sentiment away from Nicole Kessinger. And again, if you look at the timing of this Times Call newspaper article, it's September 10th, right? So it's 5 days after the publication of the Amanda McMahon information. And it actually refers to September 5th, as the prosecution had until September 5th to file a response to the motion. So the motion seemed to have been filed on that same day that information came out about Amanda McMahon and, you know, this sexual second life that Chris Watts was supposedly having, which Chris Watts had to have felt is prejudicial to him if it wasn't true. And so if you go back in time and you look at the motion, which bizarrely wasn't actually filed on the Weld County District Court's website, nevertheless, it's dated August the 29th. What day was August 29th? Well, it was the day after Chris Watts was, in fact, it was the same day that Chris Watts was, that Trent Bolt appeared on, where his name was mentioned in the Ashley Banfield sort of expose on some alleged former lover of Chris Watts being Trent Bolt. So one must say, how did that information come to light? Was it leaked by the media, or was it leaked by Trent Bolt, or both? or sorry, was it leaked by the prosecution, or was it leaked by Trent Bolt, or both? It did seem very odd at the time when Trent Bolt was sort of telling everyone about it, and there just seemed little corroboration besides him just saying that. No photos, no selfies, no evidence except this guy just saying it. But the point I want to emphasize here is the timing of this alleged affair with the other man, which I published on Shakedown on August 28th, and this motion from the defense on August 29th, and then also the Amanda McMahon stuff coming out in early September. All of it was designed either by intentional or by accident to direct attention away from Nicole Kessinger. And it did, didn't it? I should also mention that Nicole Kessinger was aware of the Shakedown blog about her. So was the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. And so if they were concerned about it, then it was certainly a way of, again, just directing attention away from any commentary about Kessinger, which she at the time said they're grasping at straws, and then give the media something real to grasp at, some real people who are making themselves available to the media, real photos, real names, real details, except none of it was real either. Okay, so we're well past the hour mark in this episode. It's been a longer episode than usual. If you enjoyed the coverage, I'm sure you'll agree that following the timeline chronologically is very insightful. You learn a lot, you remember a lot that you otherwise would have forgotten. But seeing how the information came out in the order that it came out is certainly provides a lot more kind of revelation and insight than you would have just by looking backwards randomly, right? If you're interested in continuing just following the continuing coverage in this particular area of the timeline review, please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment. Also, if you're interested in the ongoing coverage of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, we're sort of halfway through the analysis and review of that particular series, which is Apologia, a £20 million documentary series, but basically amounting to Apologia. Then also subscribe to this channel. And then on Patreon, you can look at or look forward to the audiobook version of Christmas Star. I think 6 chapters are already up. And that's available under the $5 tier. There's also some other interesting analysis, for example, the TCRS assessment of Vera Miska's motive. At this point, she hasn't even been charged with murder. So once again, it's TCRS sort of jumping the gun and just saying this is likely, or this is a possible scenario for what could have happened, just as we did in the Watts case. And then there's also some very interesting analysis of the Dr. Phil interview where Burke and John Ramsey are asked about the ransom note, and I think people will be surprised at the analysis there. And then for those interested in the Watts case, there's also content on Patreon, specifically the Atkinson transcripts. There, I think 6 or 7 episodes already up, that's also very, very interesting, just because of the depth of information we get from Shannan Watts's best friend. And that's on Patreon. Head to Patreon/TCRS. Thank you for listening.